Clerk Segrist, call the roll.
All right. Trustee Anthony.
Present.
Foster.
Hello.
Trustee Graham Hudek.
Good evening.
The record reflect Clerk Segrist is in attendance. Treasurer Slavens.
Good evening.
And Trustee Snyderman.
I'm here.
And Supervisor Williams.
Hello. Would like to call for a motion to approve the agenda with the one slight amendment.
Support?
Oh, someone needs to make the motion.
I'll make the motion.
So,
Thank you.
I'll second it.
All right, so would you like to, are you set there from?
All right. I am.
With that, what I'm suggesting, Michael, is we go ahead and read the resolution prior to the study session.
Okay.
If that's acceptable to you.
Now the appropriate time.
Did you,
So do we make
we
the
all
motion?
vote to
Oh,
approve
those
this?
in favor of the amended agenda, state aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Seeing none, motion carries. Moving on to R1.
All right. Mr. Supervisor, I move that the board adopt the resolution as written, recognition of winners of the beloved community's third annual Dr. Martin Luther King contest. Whereas the residents of the Charter Township of Canton live in a multicultural community of people from many places across the country and across the globe, and whereas the Board of Trustees celebrates multiculturalism and diversity as a way of life, recognizing the dignity of all residents and their contributions to our success, and whereas the community organization, the Beloved Community, Plymouth Canton, was established in 2014 to engage our community members on topics critical to racial justice by facilitating local opportunities for education, deep reflection, and reconciliation. And whereas the members of the Beloved Community share a vision articulated by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that true unity is possible in our diversity and that healing and reconciliation will be achieved. And whereas the Beloved Community group sponsors an annual essay contest for all middle and high school students who reside in Plymouth or Canton or attend the Plymouth Canton schools, focusing on the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. And whereas the topic of consideration was community is a group of people who are responsible to each other and support one another through activities that build on common interests while maintaining respect for community members' unique differences, answering if they had seen people or groups of people excluded or not included in our communities, focusing on ways to make their communities more welcoming and inclusive of all people, and whereas 120 students from Plymouth Canton submitted essays and the judges had a challenging task selecting honorees, the Beloved Communities Plymouth Canton selected the following prize winners. The middle school level, first place was Ashley Wenzel from Discovery Middle School. Second place, Virginia Kopp from Liberty Middle School. Third place, Brendan McCloskey from Discovery Middle School again. High school level, first place, Julius Crouch from Canton High School. Second place, Sriya Sista from Canton High School. And third place would be Taral Patel from Salem High School. And whereas these outstanding young writers will receive recognition on May 19th, this Friday at 7 p.m. at an award ceremony at Tonda Elementary School, where the top 3 winners from each category will be invited to share excerpts of their essays. Now therefore be it resolved, the Board of Trustees of the Charter Township of Canton, Michigan does hereby congratulate the 2017 Beloved Community Martin Luther King Essay Contest winners, and be it further resolved that they stand with the beloved community of Plymouth Canton in supporting the vision for a community that is authentic, inclusive, and just, where all are equally valued, heard, and honored.
Thank you very much. That is now a portion of our official record. Now we'd like to move on to
Do
the
you
study session.
Need a second for his motion? Or?
second.
Oh, okay, this is a voting?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Oh.
fine. That's fine.
So we make the motion now, was it?
That was
That
the
was
motion.
That was the motion, okay.
All those in favor of the motion as presented, state aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Seeing none, motion carries. Point of order is typically resolutions that we're voting on, but it's okay. It's technicality on my part. Should pay closer attention. Are we now ready to move into the study session? We are? Wonderful. We have, I don't know, who's going to lead? Aaron? Doug? Please take us through the presentation. We spent an awful lot of time as trustees focused on the cost side of the business. And this is probably the most significant area of revenue for Canton Township for us to help balance our books. And that being said, please.
Thank you, Supervisor. My name is Aaron Powers. I am one of the managing directors of WCA, and this is,
Doug Shaw, also Managing Director for WCA.
and I am the Township Assessor here in Canton, so I'm the fellow here that supervises the preparation of the annual assessment roll and goes through that process. So we have a quick little presentation that we have before you this evening, and we really want this to be a dialogue in the best sense of the word, so that ultimately if you have questions that are relative to the assessing practice or procedure, please feel free to interrupt me at any time so we can answer any questions that you have. But ultimately, what we really tried to establish this evening is essentially just a general dialogue in regards to what it is that we do, how it is that we do it, and who ultimately we are. And hopefully we can go through and try to provide a process for you to further understand our department, what it does, and what it is that we do. And as Supervisor Williams indicated, it is kind of a department that's relatively responsible for the generation of the vast majority of revenue. The revenue that comes from general property tax ultimately begins in our department and then goes to the Treasurer's Office for collection and moves forward. So it's always fun in some regards to that degree. So one of the things that we have here, and one of the things that's very important in regards to what it is that we do, is the state constitution, which requires for uniform ad valorem taxation of real and personal tangible property not exempt by law. As it comes to Michigan tax law, I know a lot of the statutes very well, but I always laugh because the first portion of the Michigan General Property Tax Act states that all property is taxable unless expressly exempt. I mean, it pretty much just starts with saying, we're going to tax everything and let's see where we go from there. And a couple of important facets that are in Article 9 and Section 3 of the Constitution is, of course, for the uniform and equitable taxation of all real and personal property. Additionally, it also requires that all property is assessed at an amount not to exceed 50%, and it also requires from a system of equalization of assessments. And all those are a little bit different. We're going to touch on all of those a little bit pretty quickly just to see how they kind of proceed over. Additionally, this article also has very succinct changes that were adopted when the voters of the state of Michigan adopted Proposal A in 1994. It requires that there's some transfer of ownership information in there. It also establishes the capped value, but this is the portion of the state constitution that kind of provides all the authority for assessments throughout the state. But when we talk about what it is that we do, our primary focus of our department is the annual uniform equitable assessment of all 35,562 parcels in the township. That's all real, that's all personal. Every single year, we're required to determine what market influences and amenities have changed throughout the year and ultimately derive a valuation for each one of those parcels. In addition to that, we also have to calculate the mathematical computation of taxable and capped value for each of those parcels, because this is what we're going to talk about in a little short gambit. Assessed value is different than taxable value and capped value, and the liability in which taxes are generated on can sometimes be different. And of course, one thing that's very important to remember is that everything that we do in the assessor's office is regulated by the General Property Tax Act as well as the State Tax Commission. So we're licensed by the State Tax Commission. All of the laws that we follow are laws that are determined under the General Property Tax Act. The way in which assessors act in Canton Township are exactly the same way that assessors act in Kalkaska or anywhere else in the state of Michigan. We're licensed by the state, and we perform all of the tasks in which we perform are done by state laws that are statewide. One of the things that we do as assessors is that we deal with statistics, because we deal with a lot of mass appraisal. So as it relates to assessing and statistics, I've got some statistics for you this evening that I thought were interesting that we wanted to make sure that we included. Of the 43 units of government in Wayne County, Canton Township is the 4th largest by parcel count. So in addition to that, Canton Township represents 3.8% of all parcels in Wayne County, and it's 5.8% of all the land mass assessed in Wayne County. However, it equates for 9.6% of all equalized value in Wayne County. As a township, Canton Township's kind of odd simply because as a township is not as a city, the amount of value that's contained herein is probably one of the top 3 townships in Michigan, or top 2 townships in Michigan as it relates to value. As it relates specifically in Wayne County, in 2016, essentially, it was Detroit, Livonia, Canton, and Dearborn, and we were so close in 2016, I'm totally anticipating in 2017 that Canton would be valued as the second highest valued jurisdiction of the 43 jurisdictions in Wayne County, only simply behind the city of Detroit, then the city of Livonia, and then city of Dearborn. So fun little statistics. Additionally, to try to give you an indication of how that works, is we have equalized value, and we're going to talk a little bit about equalized value and assessed value. Kind of goes back to that old Saturday morning cartoon, how a bill becomes a law. We'll get into that a little bit. But equalized and assessed value are oftentimes are thought of synonymously, and in fact they generally are. But when we talk about equalized value by class, we're talking about the 6 specific property classes that are established under the laws of the state of Michigan for property to be assessed under. And they make sense. It's agricultural class, commercial, industrial, residential, timber code over, developmental, and personal. While we don't have timber code over property here, actually anywhere in the Lower Peninsula, and we don't have anything classified as developmental or agricultural, we do have quite a bit of property in Canton Township, as you would suspect. About 79% of the overall value of the township is reflected as residential property. Additionally, we have about 13% is commercial, 6% is industrial, 5% is industrial. And that personal property category, that 4%, used to be much higher in 2016, just kind of caveat that I'll kind of take a little tangent on. In 2016, the legislature of the state of Michigan adopted some sweeping legislations that ultimately affected personal property exemptions. And personal property throughout all of the entirety of the state of Michigan was reduced considerably as a lot of property became exempt. Now, there's an alternative tax that a lot of taxpayers that are industrial manufacturing taxpayers pay in lieu of personal property tax. But 2016 was a big year, and of course 2017 affects that as well. So to provide some additional statistical information as it relates to Canton Township, we have our parcel count by class. You can see that about 90% of all the parcels in the township are residential, and we have about 6% personal, 3% commercial, and only 1% industrial.
Aaron, if I might, how do you differentiate a personal parcel from a residential or commercial industrial?
It's all by classification, and classification is established under the statute. Personal property is essentially not real estate. So when you think of personal property...
In terms of equipment and machinery and...
Absolutely. So as I started, all property is taxable unless expressly exempt, but the property of households is exempt. Now, any business that exists, if they have, for example, tables and chairs and computers and desks and phones, that property is taxable in the state of Michigan. Now, additionally, any industrial manufacturer, businesses, any machinery and equipment, all of that property is taxable. Now, the tax laws as it relates to personal property, I mean, you think of some of the exemptions. Licensed vehicles are exempt and certain other exemptions that we have.
Under the term parcel.
Mm-hmm.
Parcel's always there.
And to us, parcel's an account or essentially a parcel number relative to some property.
Tag for that item.
Correct.
Whether it be land or personal property. Got it, okay. That
So,
clarifies.
personal property could be, the personal property relative to that particular business would have its own parcel number.
And why no agricultural? I mean, we do have farmland, but that doesn't count.
We do, and one of the issues that we have that's interesting here in Canton Township is that the classification of the property is determined by a number of things. But one of the things that's considered as the assessor determines classification is the highest and best use of a property. The highest
Okay.
and best use for our agricultural property oftentimes is classified as residential. But what happens is that they are entitled to a very specific exemption under the law, which exempts them from the 18 mill school operating and the 6 mills SET, called a qualified agricultural exemption. And I believe we have 4 parcels, or is it less?
4 parcels.
I think there's 4 parcels in the township that have requested and qualify, and to do that, they have to actively be engaged in the activity of farming. So it's kind of weird caveats. We've got exemptions and laws for a lot of different things. So additionally, what we have here is kind of our trend of our equalized value trend by class. And you'll notice that it looks like we didn't have any value in 2003, but ultimately that's actually when our software probably started. But if you look at the last 14 or so years of history, you can see the trend by property class, residential, commercial, and industrial, of ultimately how the equalized value has went. You can see the recession years, of course, beginning in 2007 and 8 and 9 and 10 and moving forward. Now, it's interesting to note that, of course, the recession likely started before then. However, assessments always reflect what's occurred in the past. So tax day in the state of Michigan is December 31st. So for 2017, as of December 31st of 2016, that's the basis of what it was that we looked at for 2017. And the information that we considered was information in a 24-month period that occurred prior to 2016. So what our assessments essentially do is that they do analysis of what's occurred before in the past and reflect it as of that tax day. So that's why the dates on those curves are a little bit different than what you would anticipate. Again, outside of equalized value, we have taxable value. That's a very distinctive difference to know. I'm going to discuss that here in a moment. Taxable value trend by class is also followed very similarly to what we had by assessed value. And taxable value is important to remember because taxable value is ultimately that value that's determining the tax liability on a parcel by parcel basis. So an assessed value may be one thing, but a taxable value could be something different. And taxable value is very important because taxable value is the basis of revenue for property tax generation for the township. Okay?
And Aaron will touch on later, but if you notice the previous chart, the assessed value today has now caught up to where it was back in 2007. Where you can see in this chart, the taxable value has not caught up to where it was in 2007. And Aaron will highlight on why that has occurred.
So, in ending kind of what our statistics are, is that we have our percent change in value from 2016 to 2017 by class. And it's important that we look at it by class ultimately. One of the things we don't touch on a lot in this presentation is ultimately the equalization process. And I specified that there's a difference between an assessed value and a state equalized value, and that's kind of like how a bill becomes a law. Your assessed value becomes a state equalized value. That's done by class. I'll explain that a little bit later. But what you can see is the percent change in value from 2016 to 2017 is by each individual property class, and what's in blue is the equalized value, and what's in ugly yellow or orange or whatever you might want to call it is the taxable value. That's very important to look at. And reason why is because in Canton Township, what you see by these numbers can tell you a bunch of different things. Taxable value, generally speaking, can only increase by the rate of inflation unless the property sells or it uncaps or there's some additions or losses. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit. The rate of inflation for 2017 was 0.9%. However, you'll notice that by property class, by both commercial, industrial, and residential, we had significantly larger increases than that in taxable value. Furthermore, when we look at our industrial and our residential, our taxable value increases actually exceeded what our equalized value increases are. That's very specific on a percentage basis, and that's very specific due to new construction and the continual new construction and additions that's occurring in those classes of property. It's very important. Many jurisdictions don't have that, and it's ultimately a considerable situation as it relates to property tax revenue and generation. So it's great to see that we still have those additional revenues coming in to some degree.
The uncapping events that occur too are also attributed to that larger percentage for taxable value increases, and Aaron will touch on that also, the effects of an uncapping.
Correct. So how do we do it? How is it that we determine assessments? And then we're going to go through a very complicated process in a very short amount of time, hopefully to everyone's happiness. But our assessed value becomes a state equalized value, and that's actually done through a process called equalization. If you recall in the previous slide that I presented, Article 3 of Section 9 of the state constitution indicated and set forth a process called equalization. And that equalization process is important because that is a checks and balance system that ultimately determines that local jurisdictions assess all property at 50% or does not exceed 50% of true cash value. So every single year when we determine assessments, we indicate, okay, on general property assessments for residential have to go up 5%. That's not me determining that. That's not Doug determining that. That's not the local assessor determining that. That's the checks and balance processes that occur that starts first and foremost with the county equalization department down to the local unit and ultimately determined and signed off by the state tax commission when they meet to confirm equalization on May 1st in every particular year. So that state equalized value, when we determine an assessed value, it ultimately becomes a state equalized value after both the county and the state have ultimately determined that that value did not exceed 50% isn't a constitutionally correct value to be determined. But assessed value, or SEV, state equalized value, it's defined by Michigan statute. There's no limitation to how much an SEV can go up or down in a particular year. It's just simply the value that's ultimately led to represent 50% of true cash value. Taxable value, I've indicated a number of times it's a very important value. Well, it's kind of a misnomer because technically, taxable value by definition is simply lower than the capped value or the assessed value, whichever is less. But in most circumstances, the taxable value tends to represent what the capped value is. And the capped value is that value that ultimately is that mathematically computed value determined annually to make sure that's accounting for the rate of inflation or additions or losses. So remember Proposal A that came through in 1994. Ultimately, it was there to provide for significant tax relief. Millage rates were really high. People were receiving continual increases that represented increases in property markets. And back in 1994, everybody always thought that the market would always get more and more and more and more and more and more and more. I mean, nobody ever thought that it was going to go down, right? So the voters passed Proposal A, and in a nutshell, what it did is it guaranteed that that taxable value can't go up by more than 5% or the rate of inflation, whichever's less. And that continues as long as you own the property. If you sell the property, it uncaps, goes up to the higher amount, or if you do something to the property to physically alter it, whether or not you add something or reduce something, that also changes the taxable liability as well. But that in a nutshell is Proposal A, and that kind of involves the three values that we have. Any questions on that? I know that's confusing for a lot of people. A lot of people kind of understand it and sometimes have questions on it, but good to go.
When Aaron talks about they never thought about the market going down, what happened with the Great Recession was assessed values each year started pacing down and eventually got down to the taxable value and then below the taxable value because there wasn't any limitation on how low an assessed value could go and taxable value could go. Taxable value can go down as much as necessary, but it can't go up more than the rate of inflation with a maximum of 5%.
Very important facet to know. And here's why, is because when we talked about the decline in the economy from 2006 to 2012, those assessed values made that reduction of taxable value as well. So back during the downturn in the economy, everybody's taxable value and assessed value were essentially equal because taxable value by definition is either it's the lower of capped or assessed. And if assessed value is going down, that's going to drag down the cap value. So then you hit the bottom of that bell curve and property values start going back up. The only problem with it is, and this affects Michigan municipalities across the state, is the only problem with it is that now we're in a time of appreciation again and the market's rebounding, right? So we have assessed values increasing on jurisdictions 5, 10, 12, 15, whatever it's necessary to meet the marketplace. However, taxable value, or that value that ultimately is utilized to fund your budgets, is similarly reduced by the rate of inflation, or 5%, whichever is less. So what happens is we have a scenario where property values are increasing, but your revenue source will never increase on a proportionate fashion to what the property values are. And whether or not the very genius individuals that wrote the legislation for Proposal A actually anticipated that or not, who knows? But it's been a significant concern with think tanks and legislators throughout the state of Michigan because it has a very significant effect. We have clients that we represent that in 2012 are forced to be essentially running on 2007 revenue sources with 2012, 2015 expenditures. So something to think about.
Translate that to real dollars, real time today for Canton Township, and it was shared with Diane and Michael this morning. is the 2018 budget right now, based on taxable value increase, is roughly about $300,000 of incremental revenue to our budget. Our, just a specific line item of labor costs alone, based on commitments made through union contracts and others, is projected to be about $700,000. So we've got an incremental revenue of about $300,000 to be applied against a $700,000 expense line item. So,
And that's the case for every jurisdiction that's
we're not
out there.
special or unique, we get it. Yep.
The system, I don't think that it was ever intended for this. I mean, it wasn't ever designed in this particular fashion. But to go back to a little bit further of what it is that we do, and we're getting towards the final stretch here, so hopefully I still have some thoughts and some attention. But essentially what it is that we do is, as I indicated, we have to determine a valuation on all 35,000 parcels in the township every single year. And how we do that is essentially by the terminology that we refer to as mass appraisal. Mass appraisal is not that much different than what a singular property appraisal is. As a matter of fact, it's absolutely predicated on the exact same foundations. We essentially have to be singular property appraisers. Assessors are no different. We also have to be able to understand the very complicated statistics that are also necessary to be able to interpolate those singular property results back to a mass appraisal method. But essentially, a mass appraisal method does consider and utilize all the same approaches to value as a singular property appraisal. That, of course, would include the cost approach, the sales comparison approach, and an income approach. The cost approach is very simple. It essentially determines costs from a published manual and then ultimately considers depreciation and either the reproduction or replacement cost to get those costs essentially to a time and date of value as of a specific time. In Michigan, it's obviously tax day. Sales comparison approach to value is what oftentimes people would think about, where you utilize comparable properties and essentially alter those comparable properties to that of the subject to determine a value. And an income approach to value is essentially when we look at income producing properties, we look at different rates which actually take that income and identify the current value of net proceeds or future proceeds and derive that down to a value determined today. So this is a inverted triangle that I utilize oftentimes in some classes that I teach and some other things to be able to kind of do an idea of how generally any specific given assessment in the township may be created on a yearly basis. And this is generally speaking for residential property. But residential property, oftentimes, the first and foremost thing that we utilize to determine an assessment is it begins with the STC cost manual, or a State Tax Commission cost manual. The cost manual that we utilize here in Canton Township is the same manual that's utilized everywhere else in the state of Michigan. We have to utilize that particular cost manual. We can't use any other manual other than the State Tax Commission manual. Everybody in the state uses the exact same cost manual. However, we want to determine what the value of a piece of property is here in Canton Township and not in Cass County. So what happens is that there are specific county multipliers that take those State Tax Commission costs and make them very specific to Wayne County. Well, that really doesn't help us because Western Wayne County and Eastern Wayne County, Northern Wayne County and Southern Wayne County are considerably different as well. But what that county multiplier does is it takes any of the yearly additions relative to labor costs and material costs on those costs and reflects them down to a countywide basis on a yearly basis. So our county multipliers change on a year-by-year basis. So it's tracked. If the price of goods and materials are going up in Wayne County, that's something that's published by the Tax Commission. We alter and address those facts on a yearly basis. So we went from a statewide manual to a countywide manual, but ultimately we have to take that inverted pyramid and get it right down to the very specific property here in Canton Township, and that's what we use that acronym ECF. What ECF is essentially standing for is an economic condition factor, and essentially what that does is it takes not only the cost approach to value, but also takes the sales comparison approach to value. And ultimately what it does is it looks at the cost manual, and then what we do is we find an area of properties that are in the same geographical location of each of the subject properties that share all of the same amenities and influences on value, school district and zoning and neighborhood and all those other good bits and pieces. And we look at all the sales that happen in that geographical area in a particular period of time, and we analyze how those sales prices refer to our manual. And we come up with a ratio. That's called an ECF, or an economic condition factor, and that's ultimately utilized to take these very wide general values down to a very specific determination of assessment. When you look at the detail that we go through to do so, and I welcome all of you to do so, please feel free to go online, look at our township website. You can pull up your property, you'll see the photograph of your house, the sketch of your house, the very succinct detail that we have on every single property here in the township. It kind of gives you an indication of the level of detail that we undergo to be able to achieve those particular prices and methods.
Is an acre of land worth in East Canton versus West Canton? Is it the same?
What type of land? Residential, commercial? I mean, probably not the same. And the reason that I say that it would not be the same is ultimately we're going to look at all kinds of different things that are going to affect the amenities to that acre of property. Generally speaking,
East side is, there's three different sections we have acreage divided. The east side, and then we get the northerly west side, and then we have the southerly west side. So we have the township broken up into three different geographic areas for residential acreage. The east side is generally less.
So if, okay, like I give you, like, so Haggerty in Michigan versus Cherry Hill Village, what would the differences, because that's like east and west, what would the differences in an acre of land be?
Cherry Hill Village would be more.
But what's it going for now?
Depends on the size of the property.
An acre?
Talking about an acre, it could be today, 120.
but we don't have very many
140.
acre sales in Cherry Hill Village area because they're larger tracts and you have a diminishing return by the larger amount until we have to break it down into that smaller portion.
120 to 140,000 dollars an acre,
Good guess.
just for residential.
Like a piece of land, like on the east side or in the middle, wherever, and it needs a lot, I mean, it's been, like a abandoned building on it or something. It's broken down. Does that change the value of the acre for you or no?
Absolutely. The size, what it's got on it, everything is going to be ultimately determined in the final valuation conclusion. Applicability towards zoning, whether or not it has utilities. All those things are considered.
Actually, talk about the example you just gave, the building itself can have an effect on the land.
Yeah, definitely. You'd have to pay for the demolition.
Oh, I see, okay. So you say like, okay, that's 120,000, but that building has to be torn down, so we have to it's worth even less.
Whereas a 1 acre or 2 acre site might be 120,000 an acre, a 100 acre site might only be $50,000 or $60,000 an acre as well because of the development costs and different things that go into it as well. So there's a sliding scale on how that usually operates from the data which we see. So.
One of the important things to note with the ECF study, when Aaron talked about county equalization, does a study and tells the assessor you need to adjust the class by this percentage. We get to decide how to break up that percentage. So if they say you need to increase in Canton Township residential by 5% this year, the assessor gets to divvy that up throughout the community. How we do that is with the neighborhood ECF studies, where we actually have subdivisions or group of subdivisions or geographic areas that Aaron referred to, and we use those sales in those areas to determine the assessment changes. So every year we have a wide spray of different percentages up and down, more up than now compared to the past, but every area is analyzed separately based on what is going on in that neighborhood.
So a typical change in property class of 5% using res, we might have a 25% area and a 2% area and a whole bunch of 5s and 12s and things such as that. When we look at commercial or industrial property, oftentimes our ECFs are very similar by use type. So for example, our gas stations or our restaurants or our some of the other use types that we have would be general retail, neighborhood shopping, and some of those others may have different increases or decreases depending on the market activity that we've observed and can take things for throughout the next year. The best part about it, and we're going to talk a little bit about this as well, but when we look at Canton Township, we assess every jurisdiction in Wayne County that touches Canton Township as well. So it's very simple for us to be able to utilize data sometimes from of those adjoining jurisdictions to be able to provide us with more accurate results in Canton Township. I'll get to that in a little bit. But as far as 2017 goes, we reviewed over 1,250 building permits for changes to the property description. Those are involving people going out, photographing, measuring, doing all the things that are necessary for us to determine physical changes to the property. We added 382 plus or minus new home starts and at least 125 new multifamily units. So that's just some of the activity that We're constantly and continually updating our assessment records to identify all the changes that, that happen.
In new construction, what's involved with that is when we get the building permit, we're notified that there's new construction. So we have to go out and we measure the property, we walk through the interior of the property, typically before the property is even purchased. So we have all that information from our field inspection that we bring back and apply to that cost manual that Aaron referred to.
So in kind of conclusion, one of the last bullet points that we were going to talk about is assessing is who we are. And who we are, obviously, as WCA Assessing, is the folks that are celebrating 35 years in partnership with Canton Community. I don't know if that would make us some of the longest-running employees of the township, if in fact we were employees, but we've been partnering with Canton Township to provide assessing services for 35 years, which is a pretty big milestone in our opinion. We're very thankful and very happy to be able to do so.
Our company started in Canton Township. It was our first community. back
Formed in 1982. Yep. Canton Township, WCA Assessing provides assessing services for 28 different cities and townships. We provide services for communities in Washtenaw, Oakland, Kalamazoo, and Wayne counties. Into perspective, as it relates to Wayne County, we assess 23 of the 43 jurisdictions in Wayne County. So as before, when I said that it's beneficial for us when we have the opportunity to look at all the sales information of other commercial industrial properties, it's because we do all the properties, all the jurisdictions around. It makes it very helpful for us. WCA employs 3 master level assessors and nearly 30 licensed assessors. We currently or in the past have employed or do employ prior Michigan Tax Tribunal judges, members of the State Tax Commission, members of the State Assessors Board, State Tax Commission approved instructors, and expert witnesses before the Michigan Tax Tribunal. So that's our little slide to give us a little smile about ourselves, because we're very happy about ourselves and very happy to be with Canton Township. And that also provides a good opportunity, a good segue on a beautiful evening. I'm sure that enjoyed the weather out there, but to have an opportunity for questions and answers. And like I said before, when we established the dialogue for a study session, really anything that we can do to either get you the answer to a question. We may not have it tonight, but we can certainly get it for you. But whatever questions you may have as it relates to the department, how we operate it, how our process works, any general questions about assessing, we are more than happy to see what we can do to help get those answers for you.
For your operation in Canton, how many assessors are there? Are they assigned just to Canton, or are they assessing in other communities as well?
Presently, Canton has, on a typical day, 4 staff members. Most of them during the summertime are out in the field. Aaron is the supervisory assessor. I'm also on site, also supervising. And we have a management person that's here probably 2 days a week overseeing as well. What you'll see is during the summer months, because we go where the work is. So we'll bring in staff from other communities where the new construction is. That's where the time-sensitive work is needed, and really where the bulk of the work is needed throughout the summer months. So we'll bring in additional staff to facilitate the new construction workload. And then as we get into the winter months, we focus our attention toward personal property. We have personal property professionals that work here in Canton, more on a part-time basis this time of the year, but once we get into January, February, and March, they're here all the time.
And, I forgot what my question was going to be.
We can come back. Steve.
Okay.
No problem. Anne Marie, questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you had, thank you. You had a mix, thank you for the presentation, it's very nice. You had a mix showing of residential 79%, commercial 13%, and similar. In your other communities, are you seeing this kind of a mix, and what do you think is the most beneficial mix? Because like you said, you know, when we had the recession, we had that bell curve down. Obviously, everything drops, but some things fall quicker than others.
The vast majority of most of our communities, with very few exceptions, residential is by far the largest component of an assessment roll. In certain jurisdictions, however, although it may be the largest component by parcel count, it could be absolutely the lowest component as it contributes to valuation, maybe because a jurisdiction has a very large industrial manufacturer. Wayne, Michigan, for example, has a Ford plant. That Ford plant, back when they had personal property, ultimately had a lot of value intrinsic with that one facility. So, you know, they may have had a very small parcel count for industrial, but it equated for a lot of different value. So each one is a little bit different, but generally, most communities probably generate the vast majority of their revenue for property tax from residential. Do I see one being more beneficial from one to the other? It goes in swings. Obviously, you know, when the recession hit, it hit the housing sector before it hit everything else. Right now, what we're seeing is that the strongest market segment throughout western Wayne County, and actually all of Wayne County, and as far as Kalamazoo County, is we're seeing that multifamily is, I mean, investors want to spend money on multifamily like crazy right now. Canton Township is very fortunate. We have a lot of multifamily, and I'm sure that the values of those properties are probably increasing really, really high. The fact that we're probably not seeing very many sales is probably a good reflection of the fact that they're increasing very, very high. So every component has its give and its take and its mix in there. With all the jurisdictions that we've done, I haven't seen what's ideal, just because every place is a little bit different. You know, you have western Wayne County certainly has higher value residential property than probably portions of eastern Wayne County. The houses are bigger and more valuable, but they also tend to have a lot more industry. And the industry is another synopsis that kind of helps them as well. So there's not a perfect mix. It's just, I've never thought of it as that because we're so much of an analytical to see what happens is not to kind of forecast to what we think would be the best cake batter, if that makes sense.
I think it's something that's very interesting. My new role as supervisor is going to other communities, and I went through a couple State of the City, State of the Township events, and I came to realize who Canton Township is, what our identity is, much stronger than I'd ever realized before. We are a bedroom community. So we are. That's physically, we're locked in. This is what has happened, this is what's developed into. Whereas Livonia, you have more industrial mix. Lyon Township is more recreational, sports, lakes. It's, you know, so each community has its unique flavor and identity. We in Canton, we're a bedroom community. That's who we are.
Yeah, and the risks are the same and similar throughout the state of Michigan, residential versus a community that might have a heavy industrial base. When that downturn occurred in 2007, yes, residential was the first to go down, and it went down a lot. But commercial and industrial soon followed, and they all suffered miserably, but at different times. And we've never really done an analysis to see what was the maximum decline in the classes from the peak in 2007 to 2012. But I'm guessing the residential class suffered the most.
Box stores in terms of how is that affecting us?
Big box stores obviously are very pertinent as it relates to assessing in the state of Michigan. There's a number of different cases, and as it relates to a number of those different cases, we can even add a couple cases of our own, which would be IKEA, because we tried IKEA as well. Big box cases, there's legislation which specifically would refer different things as it relates to when a dark
We're
stores.
very familiar with it.
So with big boxes, and actually, the state representative out of Kalamazoo is an appraiser who's ultimately put forth some legislation for the state legislature to look at. What that legislation essentially does is it requires the Michigan Tax Tribunal in their independent determination of value to consider all restrictions that are placed on the comparables and the subject properties. That's really all that legislation does. It really doesn't fix things. But what you have in the state of Michigan, and so that I can best explain where we are at with big box stores, is that we have two very specific valuation concepts as it relates to property taxation. Is we have value in use and value in exchange. Value in use is very much what you would think of it as, is if I'm Home Depot and if I own a Home Depot property, the value in use as a Home Depot is a specific value. Now, a value in exchange is what actually you're looking at for that very specific property to be sold on an open market with full exposure. So in Michigan,
Empty.
Correct. In Michigan, we have to value all property by state law as value in exchange. So we really can't take into account the intrinsic value that a specific owner or operator may have with their property. So Home Depot very much wants to have every single property that's a Home Depot similar. If you walk into a big box, whether it be a Target, a Toys R Us, a Home Depot, a Kohl's, or a Mervyn's, they're all laid out the same so that you as a consumer are going to know which direction I'm going to go for lawnmowers or which direction I'm going to go for 2x4s. Same thing with clothing stores. So ultimately, developers will build these stores oftentimes with the value, not necessarily of value in exchange in mind, but value of use. It's very important for Kohl's to have their store laid out in that particular purpose, but nobody else may utilize that same layout. So it may cost them more than what the market would typically entail to build the store to that particular fashion. Now, what the courts have identified is what we have to value in exchange is what happens when that store may not be occupied by Kohl's any longer. And when you have a store that goes on the market, that's an issue. Perfect example, and one of the most recent sales that we have in 2016, 2017, is that for any of you that are familiar with, there's a Walmart that was constructed in,
Highland.
is in Highland on US 23, just north of 96. If you drive up there, there was that brand new Walmart constructed in 2013, 2014.
On an M59.
Beautiful Walmart, just gorgeous. Probably cost them $100 a square foot to construct, sold for $23.75 a square foot. And that's what Walmart sold their store for. And that's essentially because the value to Walmart was one thing, the value to, I think it's a family farm and fleet that's going to utilize 75% of the property, and the other 25% is going to be utilized for another one. When we looked at IKEA, IKEA is different in our view. The courts didn't think so. But when you look at a single tenant retail structure that at that time hadn't had the expansion on it, was only a 300,000 square foot, which is, it's 3 times the size of a Home Depot or a Lowe's or a large retailer. We really thought that IKEA was very much different, more like a Cabela's or something along those lines than it was something else. So we were essentially ultimately going with the argument that because the property is intrinsically different, it's a special use property, the cost approach would have been the best indication of value. And at that time, we were in the whole whirlwind of big box
Got thrown into
stores.
the big boxes.
And we got thrown under the big box. So our valuation of that appeal was a while back, so.
We just recently completed tax board review, March with the residents. How did that go? How many cases came through? What's your gut read? And how did the new board members do?
The new board members molded together great. What we had is a mix of, on each, we had 2 separate boards. We had a mix of seasoned board members with the new board members. So, and they worked together great. They were active together. They discussed what was before them. It worked like it should work. We had very few appeals for them to work on, though. For a community this size, we only had 78 appeals or appointments that came to the board of review. And to put that in perspective, back in 2007 through 2011, 12, we were 700, 800 appointments with the board of review. So I like to think some of that is because we do a good job, but a lot of it has to do with the market we're in. I mean, it's just, when we talk about the old sales studies, the older time period of sales that we're looking at for today's values, we're lagging behind the increasing market. So in theory, we're under assessing. So that explains the very low appeal amounts that we're having to the board of review. There is another step. If whoever did come to the local board of review, they can go to the Michigan Tax Tribunal. And it's like a small claims hearing, and that's for residential properties. They have 30 minutes, present their case. Assessors there with, we prepare an appraisal, just like you'd see an appraisal when you purchase a property. And the judge will decide what should be done with the value. Commercial industrial properties are a little bit different. They don't have a small claims hearing. They actually have like a trial to get, if you get to that point. But right now, the activity that we're having at our local board of reviews and tribunals is unprecedentedly low compared to what it was 10 years ago or 5 years ago.
Summer?
Just quick question. On the chart you showed the taxable value trend by class, you said that 2017 hadn't quite caught up to 2007 yet. Do you have an idea of when we expect that to catch up to where we were in 2007? And do you expect that the trend line will continue going up?
I do expect that the trend line will continue to go up. That being said, remember, taxable value is limited upon the amount that it can increase by 5% of the rate of inflation. And since it was adopted in 1994, that rate of inflation, that inflation rate multiplier, has averaged between 2.2 and 2.4%. So that's what it's averaged from 1994 on to 2016, 2017. Now, this year it was 0.9%. Last year it was 0.3%. The year before was 1.9. I think 1.9%. So we're going through a trend of lower than typical inflation rate multipliers. So we're going to see property values. Could I fairly say that I'd see residential classes increase by 5 to 10% next year? Absolutely. So residential property values may increase by that 5 to 10%. However, that taxable value is really only going to increase by that 2% or less. I don't think we'll ever catch up. We're not going to catch up again until the bubble breaks or if there's an ever significant economic decline in the residential property class, which would be likely nationwide. We'd have a scenario again where we'd have declining property values and increasing taxable values, which is confusing for a lot of people and usually a lot of headache. But that's a possibility if that were ever to occur. Hopefully it doesn't.
I have a quick question. The State Tax Commission cost manual, that is, I assume, open. Like, can anybody look at that?
Absolutely. It's published right on their website. So the Tax Commission manual is published right on their website. Interestingly enough, Tax Commission is utilizing for 2017 the 2003 cost manual. That was the last time it was just published. However, it's updated all the time. For 2018 and 2019, if the software vendors throughout the state of Michigan get everything working, we're going to hopefully roll out the 2013 cost manual for the 2018 assessments. But the State Tax Commission ultimately are the body that's determined to do that. So if you were to go to local government treasury and look at State Tax Commission, you can find assessor's manual, and that assessor's manual is published online for every type of property for everyone in the state to utilize, see, and review. And we have paper copies as well in our office.
You have a contract with Canton Township to perform these assessment services?
Yes.
How much is that contract and what's the term of the contract?
I know the term ends next summer.
Up next, it's 17 summer, a year from now.
Yep, roughly a year from now. I want to say the contract amount is, I wasn't prepared for this question, about $425,000. There are some charges for the new construction work that we talked about. We do have a fee for every new construction that we go out above the first 100. The first 100 properties in the township that we go out and measure and inspect, they're at no cost. But anything above that, there is a fee, and it goes up and down. Right now, we're at a higher level because there's a lot more new construction, but eventually that amount will go down.
And then the only other fee that's probably intrinsic within the contract, and I don't have this for a fact, but tribunals. We have small claims tribunals. Those are likely covered under the contract, but ultimately we have another caveat in our contract. If we ever have full litigation of a major taxpayer can be very time consuming. So for example, if we had a large trial, then that's in there too, I imagine.
Yeah.
Just to reiterate, so after 100 new buildings every year, then you charge above and beyond for each building, you have a charge?
Correct.
Okay.
For the inspection of the property, we physically measure it, bring that rough sketch, it's a hand sketch, we bring that back, draw it on our computerized sketching system, and then we enter into our cost manual and enter in its square footage, bath count, fireplace, certain amenities of the property get entered into the computer to determine a cost value for that property.
That fee for each building, or does it vary from building to building?
Set fee.
Okay,
It goes back to the dates and times when Canton Township was having 800 to 1,200 new home starts a year. And obviously, when we were undergoing unprecedented growth, where essentially we had, over the 35 years, you can imagine Canton Township was a lot different looking then when we began than what it is now. So when we had every swath of land having houses pop on it like crazy, it kind of goes back to when we were trying to, at that time, deal with the Board of Trustees and how we address growth. And we didn't have 35,500 parcels 35 years ago. So that's how we did it, is essentially on that new start fee or the new building fee.
Comments, questions? Okay, thank you very much, gentlemen, I do appreciate it. Appreciate your time.
Great, thank you.
We'll go ahead and let you guys dismiss, and then we'll move on with the agenda.
Thank you.
Now it's that point in the evening where we would call for public comment. Is there any public comment? Yes, George? Issue or other issues? Other general issues. General public comment. Not questions and answers, but public comment, please. Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Good night.
you.
George Miller. I'd like to know, I've addressed the issue on houses falling down, the roofs have fallen in, trees have grown inside the windows within the last year or so. I put a foyer on it. I'd like to know why this stuff hasn't been taken care of. It's been like that for 2 or 3 years when I drive by from time to time. Why, the issues on the foyer, why they haven't been addressed, or are they being addressed now? I put them in last week.
I haven't seen that yet, so I don't know if that will rise to my office or not, or come to my office. We'll let that go through the system, George. Thank you.
One other thing or two. Mr. Shaw was here. He's gone. If he was still here. I'd like to know, and I've addressed the issue, and he addressed it today on some things, like new building construction, whether it's a garage or a family room, there's a sketch. And I'll put out a foyer on that if it need be. Why, when you submit it to the building department, a sketch, and it's approved, and it's up to code, their code at the building department, why the assessor's office taxes different from what's on the sketch or the print and what's been passed by the permit. Example, with me, I built a garage, detached garage, rat walls 2 foot deep. That's what they wanted. I poured a 2 foot deep rat wall around it. All right, 1980. The permit was okay, there was a sketch on it, and the sketch said it was 2 foot. I go back and when I'm protesting the taxes here, like other people, half of them leaf through it and see the footings, guess what? I'm being charged for a 42-inch footing, which is an extra $10 a year for 35 years. That comes at $350. If they did that to everybody in this township, it'd be $300,000 or $600,000. I'd like to know why it's penciled in. It should have went by the code. Just like on the sketch. That's about the 3rd time in 7 or 8 years that incident's happened, just like that.
Thank you, George, for your comments. Is there any additional public comment? Is there any additional public comment? Seeing none, is there any board comments?
Yes.
Yes, please.
I'd like to mention that May 14th through the 20th is National Police Week. May 15th, we just missed that date, was the National Peace Officers Memorial Day. This has been celebrated since 1962. Also, on May the 20th is National Armed Forces Day. This is a day to honor and acknowledge the Americans who have served in the armed forces. Those 2 dates are very important, I think. The National Police Officers Memorial Week and Armed Forces Day on the 20th.
Thank you, John. Any Additional, go ahead, Diane.
Just a reminder that Relay for Life is a Saturday. It'll be a wonderful event, and I hope everybody can join us.
Good, seeing no other board comment, call for a motion to close.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none. Have a good evening. Enjoy the warm weather, guys.
Thank you.